They say evil seduces in shadows, but what if it smiles across the breakfast table and calls you mom? My name is Juliana Clark, and I was 43 when I married a man I thought would be my peace. What I didn't expect was his 21-year-old son, Mason. His eyes were too sharp, his compliments too precise, and his smile, too knowing. At first, I thought I imagined it. A harmless crush, a phase. But then came the glances. The touches that lingered. The late-night talks that turned into confessions. And one night, one mistake, that wrecked everything. I didn't fall in love with Mason. I fell into a moment I couldn't take back. And the moment I whispered his name in the dark, I buried my own. I'm not proud of what I did. But before you judge me, you need to hear what happened after. Because when secrets rot, they don't just die, they explode. And in our house, every wall still remembers. It started on a warm May afternoon, the kind where everything feels too quiet. My husband, Greg, was out on a fishing trip with clients, his version of networking. I stayed behind, pretending to enjoy solitude while secretly welcoming the space. That's when Mason came home early from college. No warning. No call. Just the sound of the front door opening and a familiar voice calling, "Jules?" Not Juliana. Not stepmom. Jules. I hated that nickname. Mostly because of how much I loved hearing it in his voice. He walked in like he owned the house. Tank top. Sweat glistening. That smug confidence he wore like cologne. He hugged me too tightly, his hands grazing my lower back a little too long. My stomach tightened. I told myself I was imagining it. Again. But when he leaned in and whispered, "Miss me?" I knew I wasn't. Over the next few days, the tension clawed at the edges of everything, conversations, dinners, even chores. He watched me like a hunter. I caught him once in the hallway, shirtless, towel around his waist. He didn't flinch. He wanted me to look. And I did. God help me, I did. I started wearing more makeup. Softer fabrics. Cooking his favorite meals. I told myself it was innocent, until it wasn't. It happened the night of the thunderstorm. Greg was stuck out of town. Power was out. Mason lit candles. We drank wine. He played that song on the piano, the one I once said reminded me of my late father. He remembered. That's what undid me. Not the muscles, not the voice, not the stolen glances. It was that he listened. He saw the parts of me Greg never did. I don't remember who leaned in first. I just remember heat. Guilt. Then hands. Then breathless silence in the aftermath, candles flickering like they were mocking us. The next morning, I left early. Didn't speak. Didn't eat. Just scrubbed the kitchen floor until my knees ached, like pain could erase sin. But Mason? He was glowing. Smirking. Like we were in some twisted romance instead of a moral catastrophe. But what I didn't know was that Mason had plans. Plans that involved secrets. Manipulation. And a growing obsession that turned into possession. Because I thought I had made one mistake. Turns out, I made two. I fell into the arms of a boy who never stopped wanting what wasn't his. And now, I'm not just his stepmother. I'm his hostage, caught in a love story that should never have begun, and may never end. The next few days were a blur of silence, sweat, and pretending. Greg returned from his trip sunburned and oblivious, kissing my cheek while I flinched like a guilty criminal. I couldn't look him in the eye. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. But Mason? He looked at me like we shared a secret joke, like we were co-conspirators in some forbidden fairy tale. Every time he passed me in the hallway, his fingers brushed mine. Every time we sat at dinner, his knee nudged mine beneath the table like a promise. And then came the smile. The one that killed me. We were having breakfast, the three of us. Greg was reading the paper, grumbling about politics, and I was buttering toast with shaking hands. Mason sat across from me, twirling a spoon in his coffee, watching me like he was reading every filthy thought in my mind. Then he smiled. Wide. Slow. Knowing. I dropped the knife. It clattered to the floor. Greg barely noticed. But Mason did. He bent down to pick it up, and when he handed it to me, he whispered, "Relax, Jules. You were incredible." I froze. Greg looked up. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile that probably looked more like a seizure. "Yeah. Just spilled coffee." That was the moment I realized I wasn't going to survive this quietly. Because Mason wasn't ashamed. He was thrilled. He thought what happened was the beginning of something. He didn't understand it was supposed to be the end. I avoided him. Locked my door at night. Took long walks. Volunteered at the library. Anything to stay away from the house. But one night, I came home late, rain soaking through my blouse, key slipping in my fingers, and when I opened the door, Mason was sitting on the stairs. Waiting. "You're avoiding me," he said. I didn't answer. I tried to walk past him. He stood. Blocked me. "You can't pretend it didn't happen. Mason, we have to pretend it didn't happen." He took a step closer. "Why? Because society says it's wrong? Because of Greg?" I laughed, sharp and bitter. "Because I'm your stepmother, for God's sake. Because I married your father. Because I made a mistake." His face shifted. Something dark slid behind his eyes. "No, Jules. The mistake was pretending this wasn't real. That we don't fit. I see the way you look at me. You need me. I need you to leave me alone." But he didn't. That night, he slipped a note under my door. "I won't be your dirty secret. Either you choose me, or I tell him everything." I should have burned that note. I should have confessed to Greg. But fear is a paralyzing thing. Especially when it wears your stepson's face and whispers promises laced with threats. I stayed quiet. And Mason grew bolder. He followed me into the laundry room. Pressed against me in the pantry. Started calling me baby when Greg wasn't around. I begged him to stop. He only laughed. "I already had you," he'd say. "You can't put me back in the box." Then came the worst day, Greg's birthday. We planned a small celebration at home. I baked the cake. Mason helped decorate. Everything looked picture perfect. Until Greg went upstairs to take a work call, and Mason cornered me in the kitchen. "You didn't give me a present," he said, eyes gleaming. "This isn't the time, Mason." But he didn't care. He grabbed my waist and kissed my neck, right as Greg walked back into the room. We jumped apart. I prayed Greg hadn't seen. He stared at us. Silent. Cold. Then smiled. But it wasn't his usual smile. It was hollow. "I forgot my phone," he said. Picked it up. Walked back upstairs. And in that instant, my world shattered. Because I saw it in his eyes. He knew. Greg didn't confront me that night. He didn't rage, didn't question, didn't whisper a single word. Instead, he went upstairs, closed our bedroom door, and locked it. I slept on the couch. Alone. Afraid. Every creak of the floorboards above sounded like a noose tightening. But the silence was worse than any yelling. Because Greg's silence wasn't ignorance, it was calculation. He knew. And he was waiting. Mason was quiet too. For once, no smirks. No touches. He disappeared to his room, but not before looking at me with wide, almost childish eyes, as if he were the victim now. The boy who thought we were in love, while I stood in the wreckage of everything I tried to protect. The next morning, the air in the kitchen felt like it could crack. Greg sat with his coffee, tapping his fingers against the ceramic mug, his eyes on the window. Not on me. Not even when I placed his plate down. No thank you. Just tapping. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I think we should talk, I whispered. He didn't look at me. About what? You know what? Now he turned. Slowly. And the smile that touched his lips chilled me more than his silence. I know many things, Jules, he said. But it's fascinating what people confess without being asked. I felt my throat close. Greg, it was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. You didn't want to sleep with my son? His voice was too calm. Then what exactly did you want, Juliana? I opened my mouth. No words came. Because how do you explain the difference between desire and action? Between being wanted and being claimed? Between a moment of weakness and a life that's now imploding? I'm sorry, I choked. I never meant to betray you. He stared at me. Then laughed. Soft. Mean. Oh, Jules, you didn't betray me. He did. What? Greg stood, finished his coffee, and dropped the mug into the sink with a clatter. You think I haven't seen the way he looks at you? He's been testing boundaries since day one. But I never thought you'd let him cross them. I didn't let him, but you did. His voice snapped like a whip now. Don't lie to me, Juliana. You didn't stop him. You let him wrap you around his spoiled little finger. You enjoyed it. No, don't. He turned away. I don't want your apologies. Not now. Then, the killer blow. I want you to stay. Keep pretending nothing happened. Act like everything's fine. I blinked. What? You heard me. He turned back, calm again. Too calm. We're going to be a family. Mason leaves for grad school in a few months. Until then, you'll play wife. I'll play husband. And he will play good little son. I took a step back. Greg, you can't mean that, you want a divorce? He asked. Fine. But I'll tell everyone why. Friends. Family. Church. And I'll make sure you walk away with nothing. Not the house. Not the car. Not your business. Nothing. He leaned in, voice like poison. You broke the rules. Now you play my game. I was shaking. This is blackmail. This is marriage, he said. Welcome to hell, sweetheart. He walked past me like I was invisible. And that night, I realized I wasn't just sleeping in a house with two men anymore. I was trapped in a war. One man wanted to possess me. The other wanted to punish me. And I had no one to blame but myself. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't as weak as they thought. Because while they played power games, I was planning an escape. And revenge. Have you ever felt like the walls are watching you? Like the house itself knows your shame? That's how it felt for me. Every floorboard groan sounded like judgment. Every family photo on the wall, Greg's proud grin, Mason's smirk beside mine, looked like a mockery. I was living in a museum of my own mistakes, curated by the very men who now controlled my fate. Greg had made it clear, pretend or perish. Smile or be smeared. But Mason? He grew quiet, colder. No more sweet gestures or teasing words. He didn't touch me again, not in the way he used to. But his presence was louder than ever, watching me, studying me, like he was waiting for me to crack. I didn't. I started small. Quietly. I began collecting. Not physical things, proof. I reactivated an old burner phone I once used during a trip abroad, hidden deep in the drawer of our guest room. I kept it charged, silent, hidden in a toiletry bag. Then I started recording. Voice memos. Conversations. The threats. The whispers. Even the silence. I caught Greg on tape one night, slurring through wine, telling me, I could ruin you, Jules. In every courtroom, every dinner party. You'd be nothing but a name everyone whispers when they want to shame their daughters. Click. Saved. I caught Mason in the hallway muttering under his breath, "You used me. But you'll come crawling back. They always do." Click. Saved. These weren't just recordings. They were seeds. I didn't know where I'd plant them yet, but I knew I would. The real opportunity came from the most unexpected place, Mason's phone. One morning, he left it charging on the kitchen counter while showering. Greg had already gone out for his tennis club. My hands trembled as I picked it up. Locked. Of course. But then, instinct. I tried his birthday backwards. 1999, fail. Then I tried my own. 0101, fail. And then, something dark occurred to me. I tried Greg's birthday. Unlocked. My stomach turned. But I had no time for emotion. I opened his texts. Found a folder marked private. And inside, screenshots. Photos. Some of me. Some of us. Some, explicit. He'd saved everything. A wave of nausea hit me. But buried within the filth was something more useful. Voice notes. He had been recording me. One file was labeled Kitchen Argument. I hit play, my voice snapped through the speaker, "Mason, stop this. I'm married to your father. What we did was a mistake. I should have felt violated. And I did. But more than that, I saw it for what it was. Insurance. He wasn't just obsessed. He was strategic. Dangerous. And just as cornered as I was. That gave me power. I copied the files to the burner. Then deleted them from his phone and cleared the recently deleted folder. I didn't want evidence. I wanted leverage. Later that night, I brought Greg his drink. Same as always. Ice cubes. 2 fingers of bourbon. But this time, I slipped in just a trace of melatonin. Enough to make him drowsy. Nothing dangerous. Just slow. He fell asleep in his armchair like a stone. I pried open the desk drawer and found what I'd been searching for, his legal file. In it, bank accounts, insurance policies, a copy of his will. And tucked behind it, a sealed envelope labeled for attorney only. I opened it. And my blood turned to ice. Inside was a statement. Notarized. Signed. Dated. Accusing me of emotional manipulation, sexual coercion, and intent to seduce a family member. It was dated before the night with Mason. Greg had anticipated it. Or worse, set me up. I nearly screamed. But I didn't. I put it all back. Quietly. Calmly. Because now I knew something vital. Greg wasn't just angry. He had prepared for this for months. Meaning, he wanted something bigger than revenge. And I was going to find out what it was, before he used it to destroy me completely. That night, I lay in bed pretending to sleep, while Mason whispered something through my door. I couldn't hear it. But I didn't need to. Whatever game they thought they were playing. They forgot that women like me, women who've been humiliated, silenced, and shoved into corners, don't break. We burn. And I was just getting started. Revenge doesn't arrive like a storm, it seeps in, drop by drop, pooling in the quiet corners of your soul until you're drowning in it. That's where I was now. Drenched in silence. Drenched in fury. And drowning in a need to take back control, not just from Greg, not just from Mason, but from the version of me they had tried to erase. The Juliana I used to be, graceful, careful, endlessly polite, was gone. Now there was only strategy. I began with Mason. Because weakness starts where obsession lives. And his obsession was still me. He tried again one night. Greg had gone to a late charity dinner, and I was curled on the couch with a book I wasn't reading. Mason sat too close, his cologne stifling, his knee brushing mine. "Tell me the truth," he murmured. "You still think about that night?" I looked up at him, eyes wide, innocent. "Of course I do." His face lit up. "You miss it?" I leaned in, just enough to feel his breath change. "Mason," I whispered, "you were unforgettable." He grinned like a boy unwrapping a forbidden gift. "Then let's do it again." I laughed gently. Touched his cheek. "Not yet. We need to be smart. Secret. We could ruin everything." He nodded eagerly, like he was being recruited into a mission. He didn't know he already was the mission. The next day, I began reaching out to names from his past. Quietly. Carefully. An old ex from high school, who now worked as a barista in town. She remembered him too well. I said I was doing a personal history project. She laughed, said, "Well, include the time he hacked into my email and sent nude photos of me to my boss when I broke up with him." Click. Recorded. Another girl, his former college roommate's sister, told me he once broke into her dorm room and left flowers on her bed. "He never hurt me," she said, "but it was scary. He didn't take no well." Click. Saved. I was building a profile. Not of a boy who made one mistake. But a pattern. A shadow. And then, an opening. I found the name Dean Marcus Caldwell in Greg's private documents. The name was circled. It wasn't a client. Wasn't family. I ran a search. He was Greg's old business partner, and a private mediator. The man Greg would likely run to if this all exploded. So I did something reckless. I called Marcus. Pretended I was setting up a surprise for Greg's birthday. Said I needed his help organizing a private dinner. He was polite, warm, didn't seem suspicious. But what he did say, in passing, nearly made my heart stop. "I still can't believe Greg is reactivating the trust. I thought that thing was dead after the first marriage fell apart." "What trust?" I asked, softly. He paused. "Oh, sorry. I assumed you knew. The Livingston Family Trust. Greg's estate. Mason's inheritance. The clause about family scandal? That's why he shelved it all those years ago." My hands went numb. There it was. The motive. Greg wasn't trying to destroy me for vengeance. He was trying to protect his wealth. To secure Mason's inheritance. The trust must have had a morality clause. Any hint of scandal and Mason's share would dissolve. That's why Greg needed me to stay married, play perfect, keep it buried. If word ever got out that Mason had seduced, or worse, coerced, his stepmother, the trust would implode. And suddenly, I realized. I was the ticking bomb he couldn't afford to detonate. Which meant, I had leverage. The game had changed. That night, I confronted Mason. Calmly. "There's something you need to see," I said, handing him a flash drive. He plugged it into his laptop. Dozens of files popped up, his old messages, his screenshots, even the photo he once took of me while I slept. His face drained of color. "Where did you get this?" "I have copies hidden in 4 places," I said softly. "I also know about the trust. And I know exactly how to blow it up." He stood too fast. "You wouldn't." "Oh, Mason." I smiled. "I absolutely would." He trembled, fists clenched. "You think you're in control?" I leaned close. "I know I am. And now, so do you." He stormed out. I locked my door. I didn't sleep. Because I'd just won a battle, but Greg was still holding the war. And tomorrow, I'd go for the king. There's a look a man gives when he thinks he's still the king of the board, but doesn't realize the queen just moved into checkmate position. I saw that look on Greg's face the next morning as he buttoned his shirt, humming like a man untouched by consequence. He still thought I was caged. Still believed I was swallowing shame and fear like wine. But I had tasted power now. And I wasn't going to spit it out. He came down the stairs, kissed my cheek like nothing had changed, and muttered, "You're looking better today. Sleeping off the guilt?" I smiled sweetly. "Actually, I was up all night thinking about how generous you've been. I made your favorite eggs with rosemary." He looked pleased, but behind that smile I was studying him. Calculating. As we sat at the table, I slid a thick manila envelope across the table. His hand paused over his coffee. "What's this?" "Your game." "My move." He opened the envelope slowly, eyebrows raised in amusement. Inside were three things: a printed list of files from Mason's flash drive, a notarized copy of the Livingston Family Trust scandal clause I'd gotten anonymously emailed to myself the night before, and, just for dramatic flair, a photo of Greg and his ex-wife during the trial when the trust was frozen. He read in silence. Then looked up, lips parted. "How do you? You really should lock your file cabinet, darling. Especially when drugging your wife becomes part of your strategy." Greg's face flushed red. "You went through my legal records?" "Oh no. I went through our legal records," I said, savoring every word. "After all, I'm still your wife. Legally entitled to everything." He pushed the envelope away like it burned. "What do you want?" "Control," I said. "From this moment forward, you play by my rules. No more threats. No more forced smiles. You treat me like a queen in public. You stay out of my way in private. And you will sit at that goddamn dinner table every night like this house isn't rotting from the inside out." Greg's eyes narrowed. "Or what?" "Or the board of trustees gets an anonymous packet in the mail, Mason's recordings, your legal memos, my statement, everything. One scandal, and the entire trust disintegrates." He sat back, breathing through his teeth. "That would destroy all of us." "Not me," I whispered. "I have nothing left to lose." "But you? You'd lose your money. Your reputation. Mason's future. And worst of all, you'd lose control." He stared at me for a long time. Then, he laughed. A low, bitter laugh. "You really think you've won?" "No," I said, leaning in. "I haven't won yet. But I've moved out of check. And I dare you to try and corner me again." He stood. Silent. Walked to the window. Then without turning, he muttered, "Mason won't take this well." "He already has," I replied. "And if he doesn't like it, maybe he'll learn what it feels like to be powerless. Like I've been." I left him standing there and went upstairs. For the first time in weeks, I took a long, slow shower. Not to cleanse myself of guilt, but to baptize myself in resolve. I knew Greg wouldn't surrender easily. He'd try to outmaneuver me. He might even try to break me again. But this time I wasn't playing defense. That evening, we ate dinner like a royal family teetering on the edge of civil war. Mason was quiet. Greg poured my wine. I smiled like a woman holding a dagger behind her back. And somewhere deep inside me, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. Not complete. Not pure. But a sliver of it. Enough to know the war had shifted. Tomorrow, I'd start dismantling Greg's empire from the inside. Carefully. Legally. And irrevocably. Because now, I didn't just want to survive. I wanted the crown. Power is never about strength, it's about knowing where the cracks are and having the nerve to stick your fingers in. Greg had always worn his wealth like armor. Lavish suits. Country club memberships. That smug confidence that came from knowing he could pay off problems instead of solving them. But even the strongest walls have weak spots, and I was going to crawl into every one. The morning after our quiet war at the dinner table, I began my real plan, not revenge with fire and fury, but revenge with ledgers, passwords, and quiet, surgical strikes. I started with the charity. The Clark Foundation. It had been Greg's pride and joy, a tax shelter disguised as goodwill. I had played the role of sweet, supportive wife during all those fundraising galas, smiling while his donors whispered about how noble he was. But I knew better. And I knew one thing he had overlooked: the secretary. Her name was Rhonda. Sweet, plain, nervous little thing who adored me. She'd always called me Miss Jules and offered me extra wine at events when Greg wasn't looking. I paid her a visit at her office under the pretense of helping with a donor mailing. "Greg never lets anyone touch the financials," she said when I asked where the expense files were. I smiled. "That's why he sends me. To keep you company while he hides behind numbers." She giggled and showed me where the files were stored. I took mental photos of every bank name, every code label, every miscellaneous withdrawal that totaled into thousands. Then I asked about the offshore account, innocently, of course. "Is he still moving funds into that Belize partnership? You know, the one he said was for long-term investment?" She blinked. "Belize? He shut that account down years ago. Said it was too risky." "Didn't you know?" No, I hadn't. Which meant, someone else was siphoning the money. I thanked her sweetly, left with a warm hug, and sat in my car breathing fast. It all clicked then. Greg hadn't just wanted me silent to protect Mason or preserve some facade. He was bleeding the trust, quietly. Stealing from the estate. And if it ever became public, the board would bury him in litigation. The kind he couldn't charm his way out of. Back home, I opened my laptop. With the info I gathered, I accessed the shared account logs. And there it was, tens of thousands, routed through shell companies. Some in Greg's name. Some in aliases I didn't recognize. But one caught my eye: W. Redmont Holdings. Redmont. That was his mother's maiden name. Greg was laundering money through fake firms, possibly using family names as cover. And with every file I opened, I realized something darker: this wasn't just about greed. This was insurance. He was building a life to walk away with if everything collapsed. I copied everything. Backed it up to a hidden drive and to an encrypted folder on cloud storage under a fake name. Then, for the first time in weeks, I called a lawyer. "Mrs. Clark," she said, "I'm honored. I followed your event work with the youth shelter." "Thank you," I said, steady. "But this call isn't about charity. It's about dismantling a man who thinks he owns me." I gave her a brief overview, just enough to pique interest. She offered to meet discreetly. I agreed. That night, at dinner, Greg looked smug again. "You're quiet," he said. "Everything all right, Jules?" I smiled as I stirred my wine. "Perfect, actually. I'm thinking about doing some renovations." "To the house?" "To my life," I said. "Starting with the foundation." He raised an eyebrow. I kept smiling. He had no idea I'd just found the crack in his throne. And soon, he'd realize, he'd built his kingdom on sand. Some wars are fought with swords. Others, with secrets passed in hushed tones and handshakes that feel like loaded guns. Greg had no idea that while he was busy protecting his fake empire, I was slipping poison into the well he drank from. And now, it was time to turn his own allies into my silent army. I met with the lawyer 2 days later at a boutique cafe in town, the kind of place Greg always dismissed as overpriced Instagram traps. Which made it perfect. He'd never come here. I wore sunglasses, a scarf, and a fake smile. My lawyer, Camille Hartman, wore calm confidence and a suit sharp enough to cut steel. We exchanged pleasantries, and then I slid the flash drive across the table. Everything I've found so far. Bank names. Transfer logs. Shell companies. Illicit trust withdrawals. Possibly even fraud against the foundation. She blinked, eyebrows lifting slowly. "You're not bluffing." "I don't bluff," I said, sipping my espresso. "I survive. And I plan." She scanned the files quickly and nodded. You have something serious here. If this is what it looks like, he's in violation of multiple ethics clauses in the trust and federal law. You want to go public? Not yet. I want to bleed him first. Quietly. From the inside. I want to watch him wonder where it all went wrong. Camille smiled. My kind of client. I hired her that day. She became my shadow general. My strategist. And the first call she made was to a woman named Teresa Lang, one of the Livingston Trust board members who also happened to despise Greg. Turns out, he'd once passed her over for a chair position because she was too emotional. Camille arranged a casual meet. I wore pearls in pain. Told Teresa I was just worried about Greg's financial confusion lately. Her face hardened as I hinted at discrepancies in charitable withdrawals. Do you have proof? She asked. I opened my purse. I have 10 pages of it. By the end of that meeting, I had her sympathy and her curiosity. If what you're saying is true, she whispered, he could lose everything. Even his stake in the board. Are you prepared for that? I looked her dead in the eye. I expect it. Then I took it further. I visited Dorian Black, the private firm attorney who helped Greg draw up the trust documents. I came as a grieving wife worried about her husband's recent paranoia and erratic behavior. I played my role flawlessly, just unsteady enough, with hints of tears and trembling fingers. I'm just scared he's hiding something from me, I said. I don't want him to get into legal trouble. Dorian, the kind of man who still used handkerchiefs and called women ma'am, softened. Well, if you're ever in real danger, you call me. I helped build the clauses in that trust. Greg can't manipulate it without board approval. He knows that. That was all I needed to hear. Greg was walking a thin line, and the men who helped him build his fortress didn't even know he was hacking through the supports. But now, they would. I left a file on Dorian's desk in a plain envelope. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The documents inside would speak for themselves. At home, Greg barely noticed my comings and goings. He was busy preparing for the quarterly board gala. It was his moment to shine, to show the other trustees and donors that he was the crown jewel of the Livingston name. But this time, I'd be the one shining. Mason, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Brooding. He barely ate, barely spoke. Something was shifting in him. He was losing his grip. And I knew the moment would come when he'd lash out again, at me, or worse, at Greg. And that's when it hit me. Let them destroy each other. Let the son betray the father. Let the father bury the son. I just needed to push the first domino. So that night, I left Mason a note. One sentence. Just enough to crack him open. Ask your father what really happened to the Redmond account. The rest would unfold like a symphony of ruin. Because sometimes, revenge isn't one explosive moment. It's a chain reaction. And I had just lit the fuse. Mason didn't say a word to me the next morning. He didn't look at me. Didn't smirk. Just sat at the breakfast bar, eyes hollow, tapping his fingers so hard on the counter I thought he might crack the marble. Greg breezed in late, tie undone, already barking into his phone about wine vendors for the upcoming gala. It happened in seconds. Mason stood. Walked up to his father. And punched him square in the jaw. Greg stumbled, the phone clattering to the floor. What the hell? You stole from me. Mason bellowed, fists clenched, red in the face like a boy betrayed by a god. You told me the Redmond account was closed. Greg's face, already bruising, twisted in confusion. What are you talking about? You told me it was dead. But it's been active for months. And the transfers. I saw the dates, Dad. You moved money out, my inheritance, and you didn't tell me. Why? I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching. Silent. Invisible. Invincible. Greg straightened, rubbing his jaw. You went through my records? Mason scoffed. Are you seriously playing that card right now? He stepped closer. Tell me the truth. Are you bleeding the trust? Are you setting me up? Greg's eyes narrowed. Of course not. I've been trying to protect you from her. He shot a finger toward me, and this circus she's creating. But Mason didn't even glance at me. His entire world was locked on Greg. You're lying, he growled. You've always lied. Even when Mom left, you said it was her fault. But it was you, wasn't it? You manipulated her too. Just like you're doing to Juliana. Greg's voice lowered, deadly calm. Watch what you say. Why? Because I might finally say what you've been afraid of hearing? You're a fraud. And now I know what that trust really means to you. It's not about family. It's about power. I couldn't have written it better if I tried. Greg stormed past him toward me. You planted that. You turned him against me. I stepped back, eyes wide and innocent. I didn't turn him. You just finally showed him who you really are. Greg's voice dropped to a growl. What do you want from me, Juliana? A divorce? Fine. You want the house? Take it. But don't drag Mason into this. I tilted my head. I didn't drag him. He walked into the fire all on his own. Behind him, Mason spat, You deserve each other. Then he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Greg stood frozen, fists at his sides, breathing hard. I moved to him slowly. You were never protecting him. You were using him. His eyes met mine. And what were you doing? I smiled. Surviving. He tried to speak, but his mouth just opened and closed like he was drowning. And I realized then, he was. Not in water. But in shame. In fear. In the realization that the empire he thought he'd built on obedience and secrecy was crumbling beneath him. Later that evening, I found Mason sitting in his car outside, staring at the steering wheel. I tapped on the window. He rolled it down but didn't speak. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, I said gently. He didn't look at me. I thought I hated you. But I think I hate him more. I nodded. You're allowed to hate us both. We failed you. He laughed bitterly. No. You were just the symptom. He's the disease. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. He looked at me finally. What now? I leaned in. Now? We let him drown. And we don't throw him a rope. He didn't smile. He just nodded. That night, Greg canceled the gala. Said it was due to unexpected personal matters. But the real reason? His golden son was gone. His board was stirring. And his wife was no longer under his thumb. The king was falling. And I had only just begun. It didn't happen all at once. Greg didn't collapse in the middle of the living room or rage through the halls like a madman. No, that would have been too easy, too obvious. Instead, he began to fray around the edges. The cracks in his polished exterior widened slowly, and I was there to widen them with every smile I wore like a dagger. He stopped shaving. Began drinking earlier in the day. I'd find him pacing on the porch, muttering under his breath, clutching his phone like it was a weapon and a lifeline all at once. The man who once controlled rooms with a glance now flinched at shadows. And I made sure to keep the shadows moving. The first step was taking back the narrative. Camille, my lawyer, had prepared a quiet, strategic legal campaign. No scorched earth. No tabloids. Just precision. We filed for partial control of the household estate citing Greg's mental instability and erratic behavior. The wording was gentle enough to avoid setting off alarms, but damning enough to shake the trustees who'd already begun whispering. I walked into the Livingston Trust building in a cream silk blouse and navy slacks, hair pinned neatly, eyes soft. I asked for a private meeting with two of the senior board members. Not to expose him, yet, but to share concerns. They listened. Carefully. I spoke like a wife trying to protect her husband from himself. Greg has been struggling, I said. He's missing meetings. Confusing documents. Just last week, he nearly signed a wire transfer to the wrong account. I handed them a copy of the error, forged, yes, but indistinguishable from Greg's distracted scrawl. They nodded. One of them, Mr. Lovett, sighed and said, "He's not the man he was 10 years ago." Exactly. The seed was planted. Meanwhile, Mason had vanished from the house. He took a hotel room 2 towns over and sent me one text, "You're winning." I don't know if that makes me happy or sick. I didn't respond. Because Mason was still dangerous. Still a wild card. And I had no plans to keep him close. He was useful as a fracture, not a tool. Back at home, Greg finally confronted me again, but this time, he was weaker. Pale. Sweating through his shirt. "You went to the board," he said, eyes bloodshot. I raised my eyebrows. I expressed concern. "As your wife. That's my job, isn't it?" "You think you're clever?" he spat. "They'll never turn on me. I built them." I stepped closer. "And now I'm unbuilding them. One by one. Quietly. Just like you taught me, Greg." He raised his hand, but it froze midair. He realized, in that moment, what I already knew. He couldn't touch me anymore. Because I wasn't afraid of losing him. I wasn't afraid of losing anything. And a woman with nothing to fear is the most dangerous weapon in the world. He lowered his hand. Backed away. I said softly, "Maybe take a rest. You look tired." Later that night, I called Camille. "Prepare the petition," I said. She didn't have to ask which one. The next day, we submitted a request for financial conservatorship. I was no longer just fighting for power, I was legally taking it. If the judge approved, Greg would lose access to the estate's liquidity, to the trust's direct control, to our shared accounts. I'd hold the keys to everything. I knew Greg would fight it. And I wanted him to. Because the harder he fought, the crazier he'd look. The more desperate. The more unstable. And that, not the affair, not the scandal, not the betrayal, would be what finally undid him. I walked through the house that night barefoot, glass of wine in hand, as rain tapped the windows like a slow drumbeat of victory. Greg sat in the study, lights off, drinking alone. He didn't look up as I passed. He didn't speak. He was learning something every man like him eventually learns. You can control people with fear. With money. With silence. But not forever. Eventually, the pawn becomes the queen. And the queen starts pulling the strings. Courtrooms are strange places. They smell like bleach and nerves, and everyone pretends that justice isn't just a performance in front of polished wood and tired judges. Greg thought he would win here, because men like Greg always believe a suit and a smile can bend the truth into whatever shape they like. But he hadn't counted on one thing: I knew where the bones were buried. And I had just dug one up. The hearing began with calm formalities. Camille sat beside me, poised, notes stacked like ammunition. Greg entered the courtroom looking thinner, meaner, dressed in a suit that didn't fit him like it used to. He still wore the tie I bought him for our anniversary 2 years ago. Irony. The judge, a stern, fair woman named Rita Boone, asked if there was any objection to the request for financial conservatorship. Greg stood slowly. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said, trying to sound composed. "My wife is manipulating perception to gain access to funds that are not hers to control. I've run the Livingston Trust for over a decade with no incident." Rita nodded. "And yet, several board members have submitted letters of concern regarding recent behavior. Would you like me to read them into the record?" Greg hesitated. He knew I'd been busy. But he didn't know how busy. Camille stood next. "Your Honor, this is not about vengeance or dramatics. This is about financial mismanagement. We have documents, irregular transfers, altered charity payouts, and recorded statements from former staff who witnessed Mr. Clark in a mentally and emotionally unstable state. If he's not hiding something, why so many aliases? Greg's lawyer, a slick man named Marin, snapped, "This is character assassination." Camille smiled. "Only if the character's already dead." The judge raised a hand. "Enough. I'll review the statements, financials, and motion." She turned to Greg. "Do you have anything else to submit?" And that's when he made his final, desperate play. He pulled out an envelope. "Yes, Your Honor. I submit these audio recordings, proof that my wife seduced my son. Took advantage of him while under our roof. This is not a conservatorship case. This is a cover-up." The room fell silent. I looked at Camille. She was calm. Because she knew I had prepared for this. The judge motioned the clerk to take the recordings. "These are serious accusations." Greg nodded, smug. "They're real. And damning." But the moment the file played, the courtroom shifted. Because what Greg hadn't realized, what he never bothered to actually listen to, was that the recording included more than just my voice. It included Mason's words. And it included confessions. "Jules, don't pretend it didn't mean something. I've wanted you since I was 16, I'm married to your father, he doesn't love you." "Not like I do." "You think he'd notice if you disappeared?" "He's too busy building his kingdom." Click. Judge Boone stared at Greg. "This doesn't sound like seduction from your wife. It sounds like coercion from your son." Greg's jaw slackened. "No. No, that's not what, he manipulated her." Camille stood. "Your Honor, if the defense wishes to introduce recordings, we can submit the full set. Including the recording where Mr. Clark is heard threatening Ms. Clark with social ruin if she ever speaks the truth." Greg lost it. "She's lying," he shouted. "She's been planning this, she's poisoned him, my own son, she turned him against me." Judge Boone's gavel slammed. "Mr. Clark, sit down or be removed from the courtroom." He sat. Face red. Chest heaving. The rest of the hearing was a slow disintegration of a man who once thought himself untouchable. The judge ordered a financial freeze on all accounts pending further review. I was granted interim control of household accounts, as well as partial access to the trust's documentation. It was the beginning of the end. After court, Camille and I returned to her office. She poured 2 glasses of champagne. "Now," she said, "are you ready for the last piece?" I blinked. "What last piece?" She handed me a folder. Inside were sealed transcripts. Years old. From Greg's first divorce. I flipped through, and my blood turned cold. A restraining order. Filed by his ex-wife. For emotional abuse, manipulation, and grooming of a minor-aged girl related to the family. A girl named Kaylee. His stepniece. I sat back, heart hammering. Camille whispered, "It's been buried for years. Sealed under a private settlement. But it's real. And it's admissible." Greg had done this before. Not just to me. Not just to Mason. He had always been this man. And I had married a monster in a well-tailored suit. But now? Now, I was the woman who was going to bury him properly. Power is most beautiful when it's taken back in public. Quiet victories are fine for survival, but I wasn't surviving anymore. I was rebuilding. And to do that properly, I needed the people who once whispered about Greg's brilliance to see what he truly was. I didn't just want to win. I wanted the spotlight on his collapse. Let them see the fall. Let them whisper again, this time, in my favor. 3 days after the court hearing, Camille called an emergency meeting with the Livingston Trust's senior board. Not just because of the financial irregularities, but because of the sealed records from Greg's past. The moment those files came into play, the board had legal grounds to reassess his standing. I walked into that boardroom dressed in white. Clean. Unbothered. The woman no one expected to survive the fire, now standing in its ashes with a crown of her own making. Greg sat at the head of the table, flanked by Marin, his lawyer, and flanked on the other side by two board members still loyal to him, men he'd played golf with for years, taken on vacations, poured scotch for after fundraisers. But even they wouldn't make eye contact with him now. Teresa Lang, the woman he once humiliated, stood and addressed the room. We've reviewed financial reports, testimonies, and a disturbing sealed record from Mr. Clark's previous divorce. The vote today is not personal, it's fiduciary. It's about protecting the integrity of this foundation. Greg leaned forward. This is a witch hunt. A betrayal orchestrated by a woman who, Camille interrupted. A woman who has evidence. Not allegations. Not theories. Proof. She slid printed bank logs, audio transcripts, and redacted court documents across the table. Unless, of course, Mr. Clark would prefer this be escalated to law enforcement? Greg stared at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time, he didn't speak. Teresa continued. We're voting now. On whether to suspend Greg Clark as chairman and trustee, pending further investigation. They went around the table. Yes. Yes. Abstain. Yes. Yes. Even one of his longtime allies whispered it like a confession. Greg sat frozen. He couldn't speak. I didn't gloat. Not in the room. But I didn't need to. Because when the final vote was cast and Teresa turned to me and said, "Would you be willing to act as interim trustee while this is reviewed?" I nodded. I'd be honored. Greg stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. His voice cracked as he said, "You've destroyed everything." I looked him in the eye and said, softly, "No. You destroyed it. I just stopped hiding it for you." As he left the room, the silence he left behind was filled not with pity, but with relief. They had all known, somewhere deep down, what he was. But no one had the courage to say it until now. Later that night, I returned home to a quiet house. I poured a glass of wine, kicked off my heels, and sat on the patio. The stars were out. Peaceful. Honest. Unlike anything I had lived with for years. Then I heard the engine. A car pulling up the drive. I stood as headlights swept across the stone path. Mason. He stepped out slowly. Still dressed in black. Still carrying that haunted expression, but sharper now. More dangerous. I didn't invite him in. I didn't smile. He said, "I heard. You finally did it." I nodded. "It's over." He stepped closer. "Not yet." My body went still. "What do you mean?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. Dad's been preparing to flee. Cayman Islands. Offshore passports. A property under another alias. I found it all. And I want in. I narrowed my eyes. Why would I help you? Because if he runs, he'll do it with the money he's already taken. He'll rebuild. He'll spin the story and vanish like a ghost. But if we work together, if we trap him before he boards that plane, we end him completely. I stared at the folder. Then at him. "You're not doing this for justice," I said. He shrugged. "Maybe not. Maybe I just want to see him beg." I hesitated. And then I opened the folder. Because sometimes revenge requires partnering with the very person who once broke you, just to destroy the one who made you both. Greg always had an exit plan. That was who he was, a man who never fought unless he already had a back door waiting, unlocked and oiled. And now I saw it laid bare in Mason's folder: flights booked under the alias Ralph Kinley, property titles in the British Virgin Islands, fake corporate shells with innocuous names like Ocean Haven Enterprises and Alamar Futures Limited. This wasn't a man spiraling. This was a man running, strategically, silently, and with stolen blood money. Mason and I sat in the study under a single reading lamp. The rest of the house was quiet, like it was holding its breath. We hadn't spoken much since the day in court. And now, here we were, two people bound by ruin and choices no one should ever have to make. This one, Mason said, pointing to a ledger marked Alamar Ltd., has $2 million funneled into it over the last 5 years. It was supposed to be part of the future expansion plan for the youth initiative. Look at the withdrawal pattern. He was right. The timing of the withdrawals matched the dates Greg had told the board funds were going into delayed project development. He wasn't just hiding money, he was repurposing charity cash to build his escape pod. I clenched my jaw. We can catch him at customs. Tip off the feds. Leak this to the board. No way he walks away from this. Mason nodded. He's booked on a private jet. Leaves Thursday morning. He thinks no one knows. But I installed tracking on his assistant's device months ago. She thinks I'm still daddy's golden boy. The bitterness in his voice made me pause. Why are you helping me, Mason? Really? He leaned back, stared at the ceiling. Because you were the only honest mistake in this family. Everyone else lied with purpose. You just broke. And I broke you worse. I know that. I'm not asking for redemption. He looked at me. I'm asking for vengeance. It wasn't forgiveness. But I didn't need it. We spent the next 48 hours building a digital cage. Camille contacted a friend in the Department of Financial Crimes, who agreed to review the documents anonymously. Meanwhile, I sent encrypted emails to 3 of the Livingston Trust's most senior sponsors, people who had reputations to protect. I made no threats. I simply showed them the numbers. Thursday morning arrived like thunder. Greg left the house at 4:15 a.m., thinking no one would see. He looked like a ghost in a tailored coat, carrying only one leather bag. No goodbye. No note. Not even to Mason. Just gone. But Mason and I were already at the private airstrip. Sitting in an unmarked sedan 2 lots over, engine off, watching through binoculars. He's early, Mason muttered. That's unlike him. Then we saw it, Greg stepping out of the car, followed by someone else. A woman. Blonde. Mid-30s. Designer coat. Laughing. Greg held her hand. Kissed her cheek. She carried a Louis Vuitton duffel. Mason froze. Who the hell is that? My stomach turned. You didn't know? No, he said, voice breaking. He said he was done with her. Her? I turned sharply. You know this woman? He nodded slowly. That's Eva. My mother's niece. My cousin. The one from his first marriage. The one he was too close with. The silence between us curdled into something acidic. Greg hadn't changed. Not once. Not ever. He was running away with another version of me. Younger. Familiar. Bound to him by fragile, manipulated bloodlines. I wanted to scream. Instead, I whispered, let them board. Mason gritted his teeth. Are you sure? I nodded. He thinks he's won. Let him climb all the way up the ladder, so he doesn't see it burning beneath him. The moment the jet door sealed, Camille's contact alerted Customs and Financial Crimes. 5 minutes later, sirens erupted. The jet never took off. Greg was escorted down the stairs in cuffs. Eva screamed. Spat. Scratched a federal agent across the face. Mason laughed for the first time in weeks. God, he really thought he could outrun it. We drove away before the press arrived. Back home, I poured myself a drink. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from release. The war was over. The king was caged. And I had one more thing to do, tell the world the truth. Not just about Greg. But about me. Because survival had turned me into someone else. And now, I was ready to introduce her to everyone. The first call came from a local journalist I used to brush off with smiles at charity events. Her name was Lana Boone, no relation to the judge, but equally sharp and tenacious. She left a voicemail that morning. I don't want gossip. I want the truth. Your truth. You survived something most women can't even name out loud. If you're ready to speak, I'm ready to listen. I listened to it 3 times. Then I called her back. That evening, I sat in front of a camera under soft studio lights. No makeup team. No stylist. Just me. My age. My truth. And a glass of water shaking in my hand that I kept just out of frame. Lana sat across from me, notebook closed, voice soft but clear. Juliana, the world sees you as the woman at the center of a scandal involving a powerful man, his fortune, and his family. Why come forward now? I took a breath. Because power protects itself, I said. It doesn't need truth. It needs silence. And I gave it silence for too long. I told her everything. Not in gory detail, not for spectacle. But with the careful truth of a woman who had buried shame and dug it up again with her bare hands. I told her how Greg seduced control into every corner of our home. How he used money like a leash and guilt like gasoline. How Mason, young, angry, broken, was both a victim and a weapon. And how I made a mistake, one moment of collapse that nearly destroyed me. But you didn't collapse, Lana said. You turned around and burned the kingdom down. I smiled. I didn't do it to be brave. I did it to survive. And then, I did it so no one else would have to. The interview aired 2 days later. Local first. Then national. People watched. And people talked. Some condemned. Of course they did. There are always those who'd rather crucify the woman than examine the man. But most stood up for me. Letters poured in. Emails. Messages from women who had lived different versions of the same hell. Some had survived. Some were still inside it. One message from a woman named Elise simply said, "Thank you for making me feel less alone." And that was worth more than any court victory. In the days that followed, Greg's empire imploded. The trust issued a formal statement suspending all operations connected to his name. His private accounts were frozen. His legal team dropped him. His bail hearing was denied. The press dubbed it the House of Clark, a scandal of manipulation, financial fraud, and buried abuse. Eva fled the state. Mason disappeared for a while. I didn't ask where. I didn't need to. I had gotten what I needed from him, and he from me. We were not friends. Not family. Just survivors of the same war with different wounds. But on the 5th day, I found an envelope on my doorstep. Inside, a single sheet. I hope you never need to burn anything again. But if you do, I left you matches. I smiled. Quiet. Sad. But real. I'd won. Not in a fairy tale way. Not with perfection or redemption. I'd won because I wasn't hiding anymore. I'd won because I was seen. And now, the name Juliana Clark didn't belong to his legacy anymore. It belonged to me. You'd think after tearing down a man like Greg Clark, publicly, legally, completely, the vultures would scatter. But no. Some of them linger in the shadows, too used to circling carcasses. Marin was one of them. Greg's longtime attorney, Marin Ford, was the kind of man who never used the word no if he could say not yet. He had watched Greg rise, watched him fall, and now he was sniffing the air to see what pieces might still be salvaged. Or worse, what pieces he could steal. It started with subtle things. A courier dropped off a certified letter on my doorstep. Inside, a formal request to cease public commentary on ongoing legal matters concerning Mr. Clark. It was signed by Marin. Not bold. Not a threat. Just a push. The next day, my business accounts were flagged for audit inconsistencies. The day after that, I received a call from a former client of my interior design firm who said she was reconsidering our partnership due to ethical concerns raised anonymously. Anonymous, of course, being Marin's favorite suit. I didn't panic. I called Camille. We knew he'd make a move, she said, tapping her pen. He's not protecting Greg anymore, he's protecting himself. There are things he helped cover. And now he wants to discredit the only person who might be willing to expose him. I sat in silence. Then maybe it's time we show him I'm not scared of suits anymore. She smiled. And together, we built a counterstrike. First, I reached out to a paralegal who used to work in Marin's office, Brianna. She had left quietly a year ago after a sudden reassignment. I invited her for coffee, offering nothing but kindness and curiosity. She came wearing a cardigan and anxiety, eyes darting around the cafe. I shouldn't even be talking to you, she said. But I always liked you, Juliana. You were the only one who looked people in the eye at those functions. Did Marin help Greg hide money? I asked softly. She didn't answer. Just pulled a flash drive from her purse. He did worse. Inside that drive were memos. Drafts of shell company formation documents. Emails between Marin and offshore agents. Internal notes with phrases like discreet diversion and destroy once printed. But the file that shook me most? An email from Marin to Greg, dated 3 weeks before our marriage. Subject, prenup reinforcement strategy. And inside, a bullet point list of how to ensure I would never access his wealth, even if he cheated. He had planned my silence before I even walked down the aisle. And Marin helped him build that cage. Camille's team authenticated the documents. And we did something Marin didn't expect, we leaked them. A quiet drop to a legal watchdog blog. No public statement. No names. Just evidence. Within 24 hours, it exploded. Marin's firm launched an internal review. He was placed on leave. His clients began pulling away. The man in the perfect tie was unraveling, and I hadn't even looked him in the eye. But he found me. At the grocery store, 3 days later. I was alone. Reaching for a bag of coffee beans. And there he was, standing at the end of the aisle. Silent. Smiling. You think you've won, he said, not moving closer. No, I replied. I think I'm just getting started. He stepped forward. You'll never be clean again, Juliana. You'll always be the woman who, I cut him off. Who took back everything that was stolen from her? Who stood up when 2 powerful men tried to bury her with their secrets? Yes. That woman. His smile faltered. Just enough to show the crack. I walked past him without another word. And later that night, I got a call. From a woman I hadn't spoken to in years. Greg's first wife. Her voice was older now. Tired. But steel-lined. I heard what you did, she said. And I think it's time someone finishes what we all started. I sat up. What do you mean? I mean, she said, there are more stories. More women. More evidence. If you're willing. I'll give you everything. And in that moment, I realized, this wasn't just about my freedom anymore. It was about burning the roots that allowed men like Greg and Marin to plant empires in other people's graves. She arrived at my doorstep just before dusk. No warning. No hesitation. Just a woman in her late 50s with lines around her eyes that told the truth better than any headline ever could. Her name was Melanie Clark, the forgotten first wife. The ghost in Greg's long parade of reinventions. And now, the one who would help me finish what we started. I opened the door and whispered, I wasn't sure you'd actually come. She looked me straight in the eye. I wasn't sure you'd survive him. Then she stepped inside. Melanie smelled like lavender and old heartbreak. She sat down on my couch without asking and opened a weathered brown envelope from her bag. "There's a reason I've stayed quiet all these years," she said. "Fear. Shame. Threats. And a payout that kept my mouth shut while Greg polished his image. But watching what you did." She slid the envelope across to me. "That changed everything." Inside were photos. Letters. Copies of psychiatric records for a young woman named Kaylee, her niece, the same girl from the sealed court records Camille had uncovered. But these weren't just allegations anymore. They were proof. Greg hadn't just groomed Kaylee. He broke her. Melanie's voice cracked as she explained. "She was 17 when she moved in with us. I was working night shifts then. I didn't notice the change in her at first. The silences. The withdrawal. By the time I understood what was happening, Greg had already spun her around so tightly she didn't know which way was up. And when I confronted him, he said if I told anyone, he'd make her look unstable. Said I was jealous. Called me paranoid." She shook her head. And I believed him. 4 years. I could barely breathe. This wasn't just betrayal. This was systemic. A pattern of manipulation dressed as charm. Of cruelty dressed in suits. "I have everything," she said. "Every letter. Every lawyer's memo. And I know he paid a judge to have it sealed." Camille arrived that evening, and we laid it all out on the dining room table. We had enough to reopen the sealed case. Enough to file federal charges. Enough to force the Livingston Trust to erase Greg's name from every legacy plaque and fundraising wing. But it was more than that. It was the final nail. The kind that doesn't just end a man, it erases him. Later that night, Melanie and I sat on the back porch, staring out into the trees. 2 women. 2 wives. 2 ghosts finally learning how to be alive again. "I hated you once," she said. "When I saw your wedding photo. I thought, she's going to find out the hard way." I nodded. "I did." She looked at me. "But you didn't just find out. You fought back." "No one ever did that to Greg." "Not really." I glanced at her. "Then let's finish this together." And we did. The next day, Camille filed a motion to unseal the previous records and simultaneously filed new charges under the Violence Against Women Act. She paired them with our recent findings: financial crimes, offshore laundering, coercion, witness tampering. Within 48 hours, CNN picked up the story. The headline read, "New allegations emerge against Greg Clark, decades of abuse, sealed secrets, and the women who refused to stay silent." The backlash was immediate. Sponsors pulled out from the trust entirely. His former allies went dark. News outlets began re-airing my interview. Melanie was offered her own platform to speak. And Kaylee, now in her 30s, sent a private email to Camille, "Thank you. I thought I was crazy all these years." But I wasn't. He was. Greg's world wasn't collapsing anymore. It was being excavated. Piece by piece, lie by lie, we were digging up every grave he'd ever buried under charm, money, and control. And now? He would answer to all of us. Because this was no longer just a personal war. It was a reckoning. The courthouse was colder than I remembered. Or maybe I was colder now, no longer the trembling wife with a trembling glass of wine in her hand, no longer the woman who measured survival in silence. Today, I wore navy. Hair pinned tight. Back straight. And at my side sat Melanie, hands folded, eyes forward. On the opposite bench sat the man who had once vowed to love us both. Greg Clark. Pale. Cuffed. Diminished. The courtroom buzzed like a wasp nest. The media was everywhere. Women in tailored suits murmured into phones. Cameramen flicked lenses into focus. And just behind the prosecution's row sat Kaylee herself, stone-faced, strong, and staring directly at Greg like she'd waited 2 decades for this moment. Greg didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. Not even his new court-appointed lawyer. The man who once smiled his way through every lie was now silent and gaunt, a shell of his former self. The trial began with opening arguments. Camille delivered hers like a scalpel. For decades, Greg Clark weaponized wealth, silence, and family ties to manipulate, exploit, and destroy. Today, he faces the women who survived him. And today, we make sure no other woman ever falls under his shadow again. Every word was precise. Weighted. Sharp. Then came the witnesses. Melanie. Brianna, the former paralegal. A board member who admitted to being quietly coerced for years. Then Kaylee. When she stepped up, the entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. She spoke calmly. Clearly. With the kind of voice only people who've spent years trying to convince themselves they were crazy can summon. He convinced me it was love, she said. He said I was special. That Melanie didn't understand him. That I was mature for my age. I was 17. And he stole my life before it began. Greg didn't flinch. But his eyes flickered once. Barely. That was the only sign of life in him. After her testimony, I stepped out into the hall. I needed a moment alone. To breathe. To hold my own pain in my hands before walking back into his. That's when I saw Mason. Leaning against the far wall. Watching. His suit wrinkled, his jaw shadowed. His eyes unreadable. I walked to him, cautiously. I wasn't sure if you'd come. He shrugged. Didn't come for him. Then why? He met my gaze. To see if you'd finish it. I will. I hope so, he said quietly. Because you don't know everything yet. I paused. What does that mean? He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Slid it into my hand. You trusted Camille too fast. I blinked. She's the only reason any of this is possible, he shook his head. Open it. I did. Inside were printouts of emails. Transfers. One of them was from a dummy account, to Camille Hartman. Payments. Large. Timed suspiciously close to when certain records disappeared from the public case files. Not sealed. Not hidden. Deleted. No, I whispered. Mason's voice was low. She was working both sides, Jules. Playing you against Greg while siphoning your case power and leaking updates to Marin. She was planning to publish a memoir about this the moment it ended. Titles already copyrighted. The Queen Who Burned the Crown. My knees nearly gave. Mason steadied me. I told you. No one in this game comes clean. I couldn't speak. I walked back into the courtroom, envelope shaking in my hand. I looked at Camille. She smiled at me, warm and proud. I smiled back. And that was the moment I realized she was going to fall, too. Because I wasn't just burning Greg's legacy anymore. I was about to set fire to every person who thought I was a pawn. I've always believed the most dangerous woman in the room is the one you think is too broken to fight back. That's what Camille thought I was, shattered glass and heels, too grateful to question the hand that picked up my pieces. But now I saw it. I saw her clearly. The soft smiles, the perfect timing, the way she always had just the right document, the right quote, the right legal thread to pull at the exact moment I needed it. Not out of loyalty. Out of strategy. She wasn't my rescuer. She was my publisher. And I was her tragic heroine, dressed in revenge and made for headlines. The next morning, I didn't go to court. I told the prosecution I was sick. Instead, I met with Melanie and Mason in a borrowed law office 3 blocks from the courthouse. Mason laid out a second envelope, more damning than the first. There were 3 leaks, he said. 2 to legal bloggers. 1 to a publishing agent in Manhattan. I opened the file. There it was, Camille's email address. Subject line, nonfiction rights, Clark scandal. Attached was a one-page pitch about me. My story. My fall. My rise. My pain, reduced to a chapter summary. She filed the copyright 4 weeks ago under a pseudonym, Mason added. But the trail's obvious once you know where to look. Melanie sat beside me, clutching her coat. She was playing both sides, she whispered. Feeding Marin just enough to keep you hot. Fueling your revenge. Selling your collapse like a book tour. I felt sick. Not because it surprised me, but because I had needed Camille. I had needed to believe someone was on my side. And now, I couldn't afford to need anyone. That evening, I returned to court. Greg's defense had grown weaker by the hour, his lawyer scrambling to shift blame onto staff, secretaries, board members, even Melanie. But his voice was gone. He didn't testify. He didn't even lift his eyes. Camille approached me during recess. Are you feeling better? She asked. I smiled. Much. She touched my shoulder. Tomorrow's closing arguments. I want you to be there. The press will eat it up. I nodded. Of course. And that night, I made one final call. Not to the press. Not to the court. To Kaylee. Are you ready to finish this? I asked her. She didn't hesitate. Yes. The next morning, I arrived at court not in navy or gray, but crimson. The kind of red that commands silence. The kind that says, I'm not hiding anymore. The courtroom buzzed. Reporters filled every seat. Camille sat at the prosecution's table, confident as ever. I waited until 10 minutes before closing arguments, then slipped a sealed folder into the hands of the bailiff with one instruction: deliver this to Judge Hale at precisely 10:45. The trial resumed. Camille stood and delivered her closing like a master performer. She spoke of cycles. Of broken silence. Of brave women who deserved justice. And then, 10:45 struck. Judge Hale paused as the bailiff handed him the folder. He opened it. Read silently. Then looked up, directly at Camille. Miss Hartman, he said, do you have a statement regarding this? Camille blinked. Regarding what, Your Honor? He held up the documents. A proposed book contract filed under the pseudonym C.L. Hastings. Titled The Queen Who Burned the Crown. Submitted for pre-publication while this trial was ongoing. Would you care to explain this breach of client trust, media gag order, and conflict of interest? Gasps echoed through the gallery. Reporters scribbled like their pens were on fire. Camille's face froze. Your Honor, this is taken out of context, I stood. Calmly. No context needed. You were selling my pain while pretending to protect me. Judge Hale's gavel slammed. Court will recess immediately. Miss Hartman, you are ordered to remain for an ethics review hearing. Bailiff, escort her to the chambers. Camille turned to me then. Not with rage. With fear. Because like Greg, she underestimated the woman she tried to narrate. As the courtroom emptied in a frenzy of whispers and camera flashes, I looked across the aisle at Greg. He met my eyes for the first time in weeks. No words. Just silence. And I knew, he finally saw me. Not as his wife. Not as his mistake. But as the woman who buried him, and everyone who tried to profit off the ashes. It was supposed to be the end. Greg was sentenced that morning, 12 years, no parole, and a separate investigation pending on federal tax crimes. He sat like stone through the whole thing, hands folded in front of him, face expressionless. No final speech. No apology. Just a man surrounded by everything he used to control, now turned against him. The press stood waiting outside, shouting questions that no one answered. I didn't need to answer anymore. My silence was no longer surrender, it was sovereignty. Camille never showed. She had been removed from the courtroom permanently pending review of her legal license. The ethics board had launched a full inquiry. Her book deal dissolved overnight. The publisher issued a formal apology. And the news cycle shifted, now talking about two betrayals, both undone by the same woman. Me. I left the courthouse that day alone. No Mason. No Melanie. No reporters. Just me and my shadow. And for the first time in months, it didn't feel heavy. I drove home. Poured tea instead of wine. Opened windows instead of walls. The house felt lighter, like it had been holding its breath and finally let it out. That's when I saw it. A small envelope. On the hallway table. No postage. No name on the front. But inside, folded with surgical precision, was a single page. His handwriting. Juliana, if you're reading this, I assume you've won. And that makes sense, victory always suits the ones who can't forget pain. I want you to know something. I never hated you. I never loved you either. What I felt for you was what I feel for a mirror, something that reflects my power back to me. But mirrors can crack. And you cracked beautifully. You'll move on now. You'll rebuild. They'll praise you for your courage and your rage. But deep down, I know you'll carry me. Because you weren't just made by fire, Juliana. You married it. And it will never leave your bones. In that way, you'll always be mine. Greg. I stood there, letter trembling in my fingers, heart burning in my chest. It wasn't a love note. It wasn't an apology. It was his final fingerprint on my life, his last attempt to haunt me from behind iron bars. I walked outside. Lit a match. And watched that letter curl, blacken, and disappear into ash. He didn't own my bones. He didn't live in my silence anymore. He was gone. And I had one chapter left, who I would become without him. Before we begin, I want to say something to the woman watching this right now with pain in her chest and silence in her throat. I see you. I was you. And if you're hearing my voice, then let me be the one to remind you, you are not broken. You are not too late. You are not what they tried to reduce you to. My name is Juliana Clark. I'm the woman they underestimated. I was a wife who married a man with a castle made of paper and lies. I was a stepmother who made a terrible mistake with a boy who never learned love, only control. I was a woman betrayed by the people who pretended to protect me. And for a long time, I thought that made me weak. But I was wrong. It made me dangerous. Because when you lose everything they used to keep you quiet, your image, your innocence, your illusions, you finally find the thing they can't touch. Your voice. Greg Clark is in prison. Camille Hartman has been disbarred. The Livingston Trust now funds trauma shelters for survivors under a new name, one I chose. The Red Mirror Initiative. Named after the mirror I shattered the night Greg threatened to ruin me, and the woman I met in the shards. She wasn't beautiful. She wasn't polished. She was free. Mason never came back. He left a letter, short, messy, apologizing without asking for forgiveness. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. We both understood that some bonds are meant to be broken forever. Melanie and I still speak. We meet once a month for coffee. We sit in silence sometimes. Or laugh. Or cry. There's a peace between us that only women who've survived the same war can understand. As for me, I reopened my interior design business. But this time, I do more than decorate rooms, I rebuild lives. I work with women who've escaped the kinds of stories that never make the headlines. I help them turn trauma into beauty. Silence into color. Grief into structure. And when people ask me how I survived, I tell them the truth, I didn't. She did. The version of me that walked through fire and never looked back. If you're still watching, and you've ever been betrayed, controlled, manipulated, or silenced, I want you to do one thing: look in the mirror tonight. Really look. Ask yourself, what part of me have I given away that I want to take back? And when you find the answer, don't whisper it. Say it out loud. Because that's how it begins. That's how you begin. So, before you scroll away, tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what did they try to take from you that you're reclaiming now? And if this story made you feel seen, like, share, and subscribe my channel. There are more stories waiting to be told. And who knows? Maybe the next one will be yours. They tried to break her. Instead, they built a legend.